This novel is actually four short stories, four novellas. And so we're going to be discussing one a week. The one for this week is called Unauthorized Bread. So if you haven't read it, don't worry about that. We're going to give you a quick high level plot summary, and I hopefully some of the questions will still allow you, the way that we framed them will still allow you to engage in the discussion, even if you hadn't read the book. So in this story, Salima is our main character. Salima is a refugee from Libya, and she has been in the States for a while, and then she gets a notice that she was approved for a rent-controlled apartment in Boston. So she gets there, and as part of her lease, she and the other subsidized tenants are required to use appliances that will only operate with specific products from authorized sellers. So when those appliances start breaking down, she has difficulty, doing everyday basic things like providing food for herself. So then she learns how to subvert the software locks on her appliances, allowing her the freedom to choose which products she is able to use. But then, of course, she finds out that there is a high cost for the ability to use unauthorized bread. All right, so just to start, for those of you who were able to read the story, does anyone have any just high level general thoughts about mainly the concepts in the book, in the story, what you thought about the story overall? Anyone want to share? All righty, Linda, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I really was surprised reading this book. I have really enjoyed it, but it made me almost cry. It just was so creepy, and how controlled all the immigrants were that were coming to this building. And it just really highlighted the haves and the have-nots.
Mhm.
But I'm really enjoying it. It's a great book so far.
Awesome. Thank you, Linda. Anyone else want to share? All right, Peg, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute.
Thanks, Robin. It was kind of haunting, actually. I mean, the fact that there is such tight control to be able to do anything as basic as the most basic human need, which is food. And without food safety and health, as well as shelter, people cannot really think or focus on the other things like education or work or even travel, even in terms of commute or anything. But those fundamental human needs are just human rights. And to have another agency, another entity come in and dictate what you can eat, when you can eat, how you can make it, and what you have access to is really very haunting.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And just tangentially, really quick, when you were talking, it made me think of like food deserts, because even though it's not as direct, it's kind of a way that people's access to healthy food is restricted, and it impacts so many of exactly the things that you listed, their ability to work, to learn, to have a healthy environment. Great points, Peg. Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
So Ruthie, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Oh, give me a second. Okay, so I'm Ruthie. I work for Google Map and also TripAdvisor, and I was offered a book deal. So the book that um, that's going to be spoken about today. I read it, and it really, like, I felt like when I read this book, it like influenced me. It really made me want to really keep going with my journey on the book author. So I live in New York City, and I work for NYU Hospital. I'm a healthcare worker. So I just wanted to participate just to feel like just to see what it feels like to be like a book author or to like encourage myself or to influence myself that it's a good look, it's a good next move. Cause I have a daughter, so I want to make sure I'm being a good influence on her. So I thought the book offer was good. So someone from Google Maps, since I travel as a foodie also as well for Google Map, and someone had gave me this. I've been a member of the DNC for like 5 years now. So when someone recommended me, I said, okay, I'll give it a try. So I'm just here just to listen and, have open mind on every thought and every word.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So we're gonna go ahead and let Gail share her thoughts.
Well, what struck me about it was two things. One is it's close. It's not that hard to imagine something like that happening. I mean, our refrigerators are already talking to us, telling us, if we need milk or eggs or something. But the one thing that really struck me was that it is about money. And, the haves and the have-nots, and that's what's driving everything that that happens in this novella. So that was my interest.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Gail. Yeah, that's a really big point, and kind of to your point, it also made me think about I think it's like a proverb or something like that, but basically it nets down to a poor man ends up spending more money on a pair of shoes because he has to keep buying cheap shoes, whereas a rich man can buy expensive shoes that lasts forever. So it kind of made me think of something similar, especially when they started talking about the restrictions imposed on them because of these appliances and how it kind of forced them to buy things where they would make other choices if they had more freedoms to do so. Anybody else want to share before we get into the questions?
I'll just say, because I can unmute myself, I'll just say that just yesterday or the day before yesterday, we had an issue with our printer, and we subscribe to HP Smart Ink service, and they send the ink to us, the authorized ink, and we got a message saying that the ink was not authorized, and yet this is the ink that they sent us. We can't use the printer until we call up and figure this out. But it's clearly, in addition to the ink, they're sending some kind of coding or recoding to the printer as well, or they failed to send it. But I think it was Gail who said, this is not, we are there, with respect to some of this. And printers are the type of thing that is not too expensive to actually get the printer, because they are making money on all of the ink that they sell, and they lock you into that. I told my wife, it's happening. Yeah. So anyway, this is, I'm blown away by this story, and looking forward to further discussion of it.
Yeah, Angela mentioned something also about I just saw in the chat about the printers. So when I was doing a little bit of investigating for this story, and it's in the reading notes as well. So apparently there's actually a term for this called microtransactions. And so it stems originally from the gaming industry, where you get in-app purchases. So and actually I've seen that in non-gaming apps as well. I tried to download an app that would allow me to organize my books, and there are certain features, you get the app for like $1 or $2, but all of the features that you really need to get to maximize the functionality out of this, you have to keep paying for those extra features. Yeah. All righty, anyone else before we move on to the questions? All righty, so with the first question here, Salima and the other rent subsidized residents in Dorchester Towers are only allowed to ride in the elevator if it is unoccupied by a market rate resident. How do we distinguish between pay for convenience and discrimination? Any thoughts on that one? Yeah, this was for me a tough one to kind of grapple with, because everyone's heard of, like, you go to the amusement park and a lot of times they have fast passes and it's like, oh, okay, this is just like a fast pass. But then when you actually see how it's being implemented, it reminded me more of like the colored only interest in theaters back during Jim Crow, where people of color could only enter through the side or the back and they could only sit in the balcony.
I see that a couple of things in the chat. Haves and it's more the haves and the have-nots, and it's like the industry, the airline industry. Let's just see. Peg's got her hand up.
All right. All right, just sent you a request to unmute.
Thank you again, Robin. It just reminds me most recently, because I am a big Bruce Springsteen fan. Tickets for his concert in Philadelphia go on sale tomorrow. I have heard from other locations where they've been on sale, the prices even far up in the arenas, in the civic centers, wherever he is, are like $2,500 and above. And sure enough, today I got the invite. Oh, I can go on Ticketmaster and I can pre-register, which will give me a bump up in the line, pre-register for free, bump up in the line. But then I can have my chance to buy these, top price tickets. And, I'm thinking to myself, is that really worth it? Other than, taking the whole $2,500 a ticket out of the, out of that, it's just that concept. Like, you have to pre-register, and I don't necessarily know if it's his fault per se, as much as Ticketmaster and the way that whole thing is structured. But it's a priority. You want these tickets, there's going to be a mad rush and you have to get on and you have to be prioritized. And I just don't agree with that whole sense of what determines a priority, because I have internet, I have a computer, and I got this email, so I can go on and pre-register to start to wait in this line for however long, 4 hours, 6 hours, and maybe even then come up short. It's just so eerily parallel. It's really very creepy.
Thank you for sharing, Peg. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute Linda.
Hi. I just wanted to say, aren't we talking about access to stuff? I mean, the poor people just don't even have any access, whereas the richer people had all the access. So that's what I see. Just the discrimination there is in having access.
Yeah, because another thing, and kind of tying it into with Cheryl's comment here in the chat, is access to the elevators is, we get on kind of like the slippery slope, when we try to figure out like what is a convenience versus like what is a necessity, because access to the elevators, especially up 30 floors, you know if people are senior citizens, that we knew from the characterization of some of these characters that some of them were senior citizens. What if they were disabled? And it's easy to say, okay, you have access to the elevators, but you have to wait. What if you have, a medical urgency? It may not be an emergency. What if you need to take your medicine, or you're getting dehydrated and you need to get to your apartment so you can get water or something like that? And to deny people access to something that seems like a convenience, like an elevator, it's almost kind of like transportation as well. We take for granted, especially here in the South, public transportation is almost non-existent. So a lot of people consider that to be a luxury. But if you don't have a car, how do you get yourself to work? How do you allow your kids to have extracurriculars after school? Because, other than taking the buses, how do you make sure that they're able to do those kinds of things?
You know, Robin, when you talked about it being a slippery slope or a fine line here, and this is why it's cool that this is fiction, even though it's close to reality. But the author essentially says, well, in this case, there's one set of elevators that everybody gets to use, but there are different doors, and the subsidized rent tenants essentially have to wait for the elevators to be free, because they're also being used by the higher paying rent folks. Now, you could see, well, I mean, there's part of the concept. It's in some way you say, well, subsidized housing is not bad, and blending your subsidized housing, with non-subsidized housing, maybe there are some good things associated with it. How you do it though is tricky, and there's this fine line. So, maybe, I mean, how would this group feel about a building in which there might be 5 elevators, for the, one set of tenants, and 3 elevators for the other, so that even though one had more access than the other, they weren't competing with each other to the same extent where somebody can't get on an elevator because somebody else's use has been prioritized. I'm just curious, do people think that that's different, or is that exactly the same kind of problem? That's a thought, just thought provoking. Wes.
Not an answer to your question, which is good. But as I was thinking, yes, it's an accessibility issue. And then, at the start of the story, how, Salima was, they get to the apartment complex and they come in and nothing's done. It's still the basic drywall, everything's cut. And then towards the end of the story, when they're trying to evade the executives and the people from the business, I can't think of it, they get into the rich side, and how, lavish carpet that you can tell was just vacuumed by the robot vacuum cleaner. And so that, like, to me, and then connect accessibility, your level of access is discrimination. And it was blatantly materialistically discrimination, and just of how one side of the complex was already done and lavish, and you had a concierge, you know, who would let you in and like acknowledged you, where the other side, it's just basic. And so that just really struck me, and it's a metaphor to, at least in my opinion, of how your level of access opens doors, and what's behind that door looks very different based on what is accessible to you. And I think that's just a true metaphor to life here in our country.
So, anyone else have any thoughts on Jamel's question? One of the things that it made me think of in that regard, Jamel, and also I think it was another comment that someone else said as well. I think it was your comment about having subsidized and market rate tenants in the same building, and how it can be, good for, those cross-built relationships. But in this way, you're still segregating them, right? So
Right.
whatever benefits would have been had societally, you're essentially nixing that completely. And it actually makes me think of certain schools, certain integrated schools where you have a track or a program for gifted children. And a lot of times white children are funneled to a specific track, and children of color are funneled to a different track. So even though they're in the same building, they're essentially segregated by the ways that the policies are enforced. And that's exactly what was happening here. They're in the same building, but they're still segregated because of the ways that the policies were enforced. And even if they were to have, to try to get to your point about the equity, to make sure that, both sides got, probably like a relative number of elevators to their population in the building. But one, it still maintains the segregation. It still maintains separate but equal. And then that equality may begin to degrade, because like to Wes's point, the elevators break down, on the market rent side, the elevator breaks down, you send out a super immediately. On the subsidized side, an elevator breaks down, they may wait a week, 2 weeks. You know what I mean? Like the way we institute these policies, even though on the surface it seems like it's very egalitarian, we end up, self-segregating and enforcing that privilege on one side or the other. Yep. And let's see, Peg also noted in the comments that, even with COVID vaccine and hospitalizations, equity of access was another big thing. And that's a great point. All righty. Do we want to move on to the next question? Jamel, do you want to take either 2 or 3? I think we could go to either question, either 2 or 3.
I will put both in, and so we can think about them both at the same time. How's that?
That works for me.
So I just put them in the chat. One is, so now we get to the appliances. First we were talking about the elevators. Now we get to the appliances. All the subsidized apartments are equipped with restrictive appliances that residents are not allowed to exchange. And what's the line between free market and exploitation? And so we'll deal with that one. And then the other one is, with how the company decides, basically when they learn that Salima and others have been jailbreaking the software, they decide to implement a new program where they'll charge per use to allow users to subvert the product logs. And this gets into this issue of microtransactions, and is it ethical for companies to profit from things that people are already doing, or is it just smart business? So these really do go together, and I'm curious to see people's reaction to how this storyline works. But I just kept thinking of the company town, where the whole notion of being employed by somebody, and then whether it was a mining community or some other kind of community where you're basically working on a campus, and you're forced to buy what the company provides you. You're forced to live in the housing. You're forced to follow all those rules. Here, it's not necessarily a job that's the contractual relationship, but it's a contractual relationship that goes with housing. And to be able to, part of the story, at the beginning talks about the importance of housing, especially for immigrants or refugees, and what it means for them to be in more of a stable type of housing environment. But to do that, they basically have to sign on to this stuff. Where do we draw the line between what's fair, what might be a fair profit, and what might be unethical exploitation? So any thoughts on that from the group? And Gail, I'll ask you to unmute.
Well, what I was thinking as you were talking was there really needs to be discussion and thought about what are those rock bottom rights that people have. I mean, do you have a right to have more legroom on an airplane? Or, I mean, we're talking about the right to decent housing, decent water, decent air to breathe, healthcare. So where is that dividing line where you say, okay, that's choice, I can either, buy this diamond ring or that diamond ring, or, the basic rock solid things that everybody is entitled to having. So that's what struck me when you were talking about that.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point too, Gail, about how we figure out what things people have rights and access to, because, not everyone agrees, right? And I think depending on your level of privilege and whether or not you stand to make gains from, certain types of businesses, your viewpoint on that may change, right? So I remember reading an article a couple of years ago about Nestle trying to buy up springs, a lot of springs and access to land that fed into municipal waterways. And so then essentially public water would then be privatized in a sense if Nestle owned the rights to these, so I think it's easy off the top to just, when you were saying that, the first thing that popped into my head was like, oh, okay, just basic necessities, like you said, Gail, access to food, access to water, access to clean air. But then how do we determine, like, not everyone agrees on, how clean is clean enough for clean air, how clean is clean enough for clean water. And then when you were mentioning, like, okay, leg room on an airplane, as an able-bodied person, I can squeeze myself into a tight space for like 2 or 3 hours and be okay. But what if someone has mobility issues and they can't squeeze their legs into there? So now their definition of what is a necessity becomes different than mine, right? So I think that's the other thing that is incredibly challenging in a free market society like the one that we have, especially one that is so very driven on economics, is so driven on maximizing profit, you know. So what when we make those determinations, that's another thing that is really important about having a diverse set of people to the table. Because I think a couple people even mentioned it. I think Angela mentioned it in the chat. You know, the accessibility issues are going to look different and sound different for different people. And how do we make sure that the people who need to define those things are actually in the room when we're making those decisions? Anyone else have any thoughts?
As you talk about it, and both you and Gail, and we're talking about, well, what are the minimal things? What are like the basic things? I guess another way to look at it is also, what line do we draw when something becomes too unequal? In other words, there are inequalities, out there. There are, the way our system works, there are have and have nots. But at some point, you've got to say, well, this is so unequal. Something has to be done. Something has to step in and provide a little bit more balance. I don't know what that is, but it's not, to me, yeah, you can talk about basic rights and that leads to all sorts of questions, but some of it is just, how much inequality is it okay for a society to tolerate? And what we're seeing right now is it's more and more and more and more unequal. More inequality and more concentration of wealth than ever before in this country, leading to some of these things. It's almost as if, is there you kind of have like an inequality measure and say, well, that crosses a line, and that's where we have to change things. Not necessarily, because it's not just about rights. It's about how do we want do we want to live in something that's just so unequal? I'm rambling now, but it's kind of like a flip side of the issue.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And another thing too, to tie it back to Salima's situation as an immigrant, and also a story I was listening to on NPR maybe a couple of months ago. I think another thing that we have to figure out how to overcome is defining access, or defining what is good for people by what they already have. So a lot of times, especially for immigrants, we'll say, if they're being exploited by their employers once they get here to the US, we'll say like, oh, well, it's still better than where they were. You know what I mean? And so a lot of times we have this like relative condition. It's like, oh, well, it's better than before, so it's fine. And it's like, well, but if we wouldn't take that as, Americans, no, it's not fine. Or if you wouldn't take that as a white person, no, it's not fine to expect, a Black person, a Latinx person to take it just because we've had it worse before. If you as an able-bodied person wouldn't want to be subjected to this. No, it's not fine to expect someone else to, because they didn't have access to something before. I think that's another thing that we have to also try to be careful that we don't do a lot, because I feel that that happens a lot for those of us that do have, you know, a certain baseline of privilege, that we judge someone else's condition by what they had before versus what they have now. So Peg, you listed here, as with sexual orientation, equality on all levels too. Would you mind expanding a little bit about, even if you just want to write it in the chat, if you didn't want to unmute or anything, about what you're thinking about there?
Thanks, Robin. I just meant in terms of access to everything from healthcare, or, you know, equality is equality, means kind of all people on all levels, regardless of age, race, gender, orientation, political party affiliation, education level, should have access to the same services, same provisions as everybody else, and not for a fee, and not in an order of priority or something, but just equal access is equal access.
Okay, I got you. I'm with you now, because that makes a lot of sense. I do recently remember reading discussions within the LGBTQ community around marriage equality. So I'm glad you brought that up, because, you know, some people are of the mindset of like, well, why does it matter to get married? Especially, you know, for het people who may decide that, you know, it's not a big deal for them. And the point that was made was exactly like you were saying about access to healthcare. When someone is your partner or spouse, and they're legally identified as such, they have access to your health insurance. They're able to inherit from you. They're able to be, you know, put onto your resources in a way that, you know, you wouldn't be able to otherwise, because marriage defines this connection to another person. And by blocking people from that based on sexual orientation is another way that we're limiting people's access.
Exactly.
That's an awesome point. Thank you, Peg.
Wes, you put something in the chat that I found really interesting, and we hadn't really touched on this in some of our questions, but you raised the issue of how you found it interesting, how it was the children who were adamant about standing up to this, and there's so many aspects to this little short novella that it's like an onion. I mean, it's just got layers and layers. We could be talking about it for a while. And those of you, if you haven't read it, seriously, I mean, these are short things. They're really good. But Wes, as you read this, tell us how you know your students. What put them in the situation and tell us what you think might happen.
So the thought literally just entered as we were discussing this last question. And so I just thought about it. Knowing my students, some would just fall in line. And I think it would be true, and almost honestly, I bet the percentages wouldn't differ too much from classroom to classroom. They're going to be the ones who they are told by a figure who they respect and look up to and view as an auntie or whatnot. And they would say, okay, yep. But then there will be those who are just like, oh, hell no. We're going to stick it to the man. They've stuck it to us. Here's our chance. Let's take advantage of it. Yeah. So, and I can literally like picture some students, and like if they were surrounded with Salima and hearing this, I could see certain students who'd like, yep, they totally fall in line, do what they're sold. And then there'd be these who would like, oh, no, this ain't happening. So, yeah. Oh, Angela put a good thing, but yeah, it was just a thought literally that just popped into my head within the last 5 minutes. So,
Yeah. So Angela, if you don't mind me reading your comment, I'm gonna read this. Nadifa said about their kids, if they understood risks, they wouldn't join uprising and march in the streets, and the world would be a simpler place. Not a better one, but of course, simpler. And that's very true, especially like so many youth activists nowadays. And it's funny too, like a lot of times they don't think about the immediate consequences to themselves, but they are thinking about the consequences for the future. And that's why they're out there, you know, and that is what gives me so much hope that they're willing to, you know, sacrifice their safety in the now for our collective safety in the future. And I wish that we adults would get it together so they wouldn't have to deal with this so much. But yeah, awesome. Uh, awesome quote there, Angela. Thank you. Alrighty, so the next question we're going to ask, a repeated theme in the story is choice. At their meeting with Salima, Raj from Belangism tells Salima that she has a choice to use their appliance and a choice to live in Dorchester Towers. How meaningful is choice when it's difficult to exercise your options? Any thoughts there?
I just put it in the chat. I think I failed to hit enter on one of them before, so this time I got better.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. So for me too, this kind of goes back to the points that someone made earlier. I forgot who exactly, but we started talking about, you know, food deserts, and we talk about poor health in certain communities, high blood pressure, heart disease, higher rates of health issues and things like that, and how they have a choice in what they eat. They have a choice in whether or not they're exercising and things like that. But that's a prime example of difficulty of exercising choice. If you don't have access to easy access to healthy food, if you don't have safe places to work out, if you don't have sidewalks in your neighborhood to just get outside and walk, you know, how meaningful are these choices for people?
I see in the chat that Angela says, I literally slammed the book on the table when he said that. They didn't have any choice at all. Who else, for different parts of this story, I mean, based on what people said in the beginning, there might have been a few slamming. As I read it, I was like, this one is called Unauthorized Bread, but the whole collection is called Radicalized. And especially when you hear the story of what the kids see and how they react to it, it's sort of like people sometimes say, well, how does somebody get radicalized? What is it? What is it now that's causing people to be radicalized? And I think the author is basically saying, well, it's kind of like day-to-day life, when you look at it. So I just saw something. I got to read what Peg. Let's get you to unmute.
And Jamal, is in this case, as it relates to this story, Salima and the kids and, you know, the rest of the people in the apartment building, at what point is their search for freedom radical? Is their search for the right to choose what and how they eat and all of that, is that radical? At what point do we draw a line, or do we start to define daily necessities as radical?
That's a good point. It's sort of like we call it radical, but like you're saying, if this is a reaction to everyday stuff, is it really that radical? To me, this was kind of mind blowing. So
Yeah. And it's kind of like the activists around water rights, around the rights to have clean drinking water. Like in Ferguson, like, why is that radical? Like, they just want clean water. Yeah. And Grant, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, you go ahead. I think you're about to talk about what Grant did. So
Yeah, he put a note in the chat saying that they saw a study how people 26 to 35 are less likely to have left home or moved less than 100 miles than previous generations. And yeah, I totally get that. It feels like it's part of the crunch, you know, that makes it difficult, especially in trying times. Our society is a very individualistic society. So, you know, we're used to having that freedom of mobility to be able to provide for yourself and go and do different things. But staying close to home is really becoming, you know, less of just a choice and more of a necessity. Because you mentioned in there the housing markets, people being priced out of home and shelter. So having to stay close to home, close to your parents, close to other relatives. So you kind of have that safety net. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this one? Yeah, that's another one too. Reading through the comments, Peg was, you know, put in there, civil rights, is it radical? Education, is it radical? Yeah, just the ability and the opportunity to learn about our own history. You know, that's another reason why I love reading so much, and especially fiction. When I was a teenager, the way history was taught to us was very kind of white centric, very, you know, founding fathers. And I grew up in a predominantly Black city, you know, and it was just basically the way the curriculums were taught to us. And just the way that my life existed at that time, I knew that there were things that I wasn't being taught. I knew that there were inaccuracies because things just literally didn't make sense. I learned more from my father, you know, about the truth of the history of this country. And now we're having these different fights about learning about an accurate portrayal of the history. And that isn't something that should be radical. Sorry, Wes, you have your hand up.
No, and I was just putting this in the chat. You know, when it comes to housing, I think how you know, it's a relatively in the last 3 to 5 years of how I have learned how just housing and the accessible and that right is relatively new for African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally, it was not until the 60s where you could even get a loan to get a house. You know, I mean, that's not as if it's some far away thing. Like, no, that is literally, there are people still alive today, and you can still look at deeds to houses that say do not rent, and then it uses very old terms to describe identities. But yeah, so I was just putting that in the chat. And I think too, in this terms of choice and freedom, and I put this in the chat, but like typically you hear those words outside of access to abortion and reproductive freedom, but typically the left doesn't talk enough, in my opinion. We don't talk enough about freedom and how so many, you know, what freedom comes about when you have a place to live, what freedom comes about when you have access to education. And I think the more we can use those terms, I think will allow people to maybe take more of an opportunity to hear. And that's even people who will say, oh, I'm a proud Democrat or I'm progressive. They don't, you know, a lot of times they're not all open to these big ideas, if you will, or these radical ideas. But by you talking about how housing is about freedom in so many ways, I really think that can help the narrative, if you will. So yeah, that's what I want to share.
Yeah. When you were speaking, Wes, it made me think of how in the Sum of Us, Heather McGee talks about, you know, a zero-sum game. I think that is a lot of the problem for us as a society. We always feel that someone else's freedoms, someone else's liberties are encroaching on our own freedoms, you know, and so then we want to bar them and bar their access to things, because then it's like, well, why should I have to pay for this? Why should I have to do this? And two of the biggest things that I think come under that a lot are public libraries and public education. And people are always like, well, why do I have to pay taxes to support, you know, something that I'm not even going to use, you know, and looking at it as like a zero-sum game, as opposed to seeing how collectively as a society we all benefit from having access to these resources.
I was thinking very much about the Sum of Us as well, when I read this, and I mentioned in the chat, I mistyped, but it's also a great book. It's not fiction. But it is a great book. I think we'll try to put a link in so that people can see it. I'll look for one right now.
Yeah. Another note that I had regarding choice was how we don't think about who determines what those choices are. Because that is the exact situation that Salima and the other subsidized renters dealt with. You know, people would say you have a choice, but someone else decided what those choices were for them. So a lot of times we can say like, oh, you have a choice between this and that. And it's like, but someone else determined what these options are. And I think we don't think about that enough. Alrighty, any other thoughts? I'm putting the last question so we can wrap up. We're hitting 9:35. I think we're scheduled to go to 10 Eastern. So I'll drop in this last question, unless you want to take it, Jamel. Okay. Alrighty, so Wyoming helps Salima avoid discovery by her landlords by providing her code to help her circumvent the authorization checks. Because when she jailbreaks her devices, it basically sends an alert to the company that this code is not the correct code. Wyoming helps her use a type of code that will approve those checks. However, Wyoming also works for the company that would potentially prosecute Salima Wyoming is technically also the reason that Salim was on their radar in the first place. So we've been talking a lot about, freedoms, choices, access, and Wyoming is kind of in a situation where, she's trying to help, but she also works for the company. So can you be an ally if you work for a system of exploitation? What do you guys think?
Wes says, oof. To me, I'll just say that somehow I thought the author was trying to show how there were opportunities, for people to bridge some of these gaps, in terms of haves and have-nots, somebody within the system, somebody, outside the system, somebody whose name is Wyoming, like very Wyoming, as opposed to Salima. And what I liked was that there was the possibility of this, and at the same time, it's not that simple. There are a lot of emotions on both sides, and again, in a very short story with just a couple of dialogues between the two of them, he's kind of captured this tension. So my short answer is yes, it's possible. And at the same time, it's not simple, whether they successfully navigated this relationship or not, it's who would be to say. But I thought that the fact that there was that it was included as an opportunity, I actually liked. So that's my thought.
Oh, I love this question, Peg. So Peg says, who changed more, Wyoming or Salima? Is a long-term friendship possible between these two women? That's a great question. Anyone wanna tackle Peg's question there?
Maybe Peg can tackle the question.
I kind of feel like in some regards, Wyoming changed a little bit more, because I feel that, especially initially meeting Salima, Wyoming had a very narrow view of how the world works, and when Salima brought up different issues, that Wyoming hadn't considered, especially, with regards to like the affiliate program, Wyoming was like, oh, this is a great solution. And Salim was like, but is it really? She helped Wyoming to expand her worldview. That's another reason why relationships are so pivotal. We learn from each other when you have friendships with people. And Peg, I see your hand up. I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Thanks again. I just wonder, because at one point, Wyoming says that she didn't expect to stay with that company for any long period of time. So, I mean, to me, she kind of played like an anti-hero, so to speak. I mean, she's ultimately helping Salima and the rest of the people in that building. Is she doing that altruistically? Is she doing that out of a sense of guilt? Or is she doing that out of a sense of rebellion that she herself doesn't like boulangerie, and she is like silently somehow protesting the whole scheme of that?
I love that. I think it's both. Right? She may have had some initial guilt because at the meeting, with Raj, and there was one other guy, I forget his name. But when she brought them to Salima's apartment for to discuss the affiliate program, and she saw the way that Raj interacted with Salima, and she was like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. So I think she had some initial guilt, because Salima even said she looked at Wyoming and Wyoming's face kind of collapsed. And so I think you're right, Peg. I think it's both. I think she had a little bit of guilt around that. And then she was like, you know what? I was part of this system. I'm going to subvert this system and rebel by helping my new friend. Wes, you had a comment?
Yeah, when you originally put the question out there, it's like, ooh, can you be an ally within a system of exploitation? And I was like, I I don't know if ally is the right word, and it made me think of and the correct source was cited within that link. But I saw this scale. It's a racism scale. Top half doesn't really apply to the story, I don't quite think. And that question, particularly with Wyoming and Salima's relationship, but definitely I see that bottom half of the scale. Um, you know, you could even say woke justification, and where would Wyoming be on that scale? I'm not quite sure, but and Peg, even the words you were using as you put it that question, that's just immediately where my mind went, and I just thought of this scale and what does it mean to be an ally, and can you really be an ally? I don't, and I struggle with this question when thinking, because the reality is, and it doesn't often get discussed, but the reality of like our public school system is inherently racist in of itself. And so as someone who benefits, and gets a salary from that system, like, am I just an ally? Or and do I need to even go further, and what does that look like? So that's just where my mind was going in relation to the original question. So
Yeah. And that's a hard one, Wes. I think your situation is potentially a little different, and it's very nuanced, because you have a company like Amazon or like Facebook, especially like Amazon, Starbucks, where you have people who are working on the ground, lower wage workers, people working in warehouses, people working in factories, because they need those wages to support their families. They are technically supporting a system of exploitation by helping that company go. But at the same time, they are doing what they need to survive, right? Then you have people at Amazon who are decision makers, who actually decide how the company is going to run, what those companies' business policies are going to be, and those people who help to enforce those. So I think we have to look at those two types of people very differently. And then, at least from my perspective, from your situation, Wes, like if Amazon did not exist, free market enterprise still would exist in this country. You know what I mean? Capitalism would go on. But our public school system is such a vital entity. And even though the system itself is inherently racist, it serves a necessary function. So I feel that those who work within the system have both a responsibility, but also they're providing, for our future by doing the work within that system. You know what I mean? People who are bringing about the change within a system that serves a necessary function, but that has inherent bias, not because the system itself is biased, but because our society is biased and it exists within our society, if that makes sense. So I think those are two different ways to look at that, at least from my perspective. Yep. Yep. And Beth puts that it seems that Wyoming, I hope you're okay with me reading this out, Beth. It seems that Wyoming can be an ally, but must understand that they're not in equitable situations. Very good point. Very good point. Wyoming might lose her job, but she can afford that. Selena and the other tenants could possibly lose their home and even refugee status. Excellent point, and something that I think a lot of allies probably need to consider. I think it's something, especially as we move forward in conversations about how we change systems, because it goes back to what we were talking about before. Like, Wyoming had a very narrow focus of how things worked. And then when she saw that that was not Salima's truth, then, her perspective changed. And I think a lot of times people who are attempting to be allies, attempting to do the work, when they go into that without that knowledge of how what they are potentially risking is very different from what someone else is risking. That's a great point, Beth. Thank you. All righty, so we got